Hi, everyone. So I'm giving a day three David Burke Preliminary hearing update. I am outside the courtroom. We are on a lunch break. I did not start off immediately in there. I got in a little late. I am very grateful to the people that help out at this courthouse. They're very professional, and I was able to get in on a media pass when a spot did open up. So when I joined the courtroom, there's a witness on the stand. I don't have her name, but she does work for doing basically what I got from her was a lab analysis on evidence that there was. So the evidence that was shown up on the screen had to do with the blue inflatable pool that was found at David's home. Now, when you look at the image of the pool that was on the screen, it was on a table. It's intact. You can't see it in pieces. So you can see everywhere where basically the headrests would be and those seats in the four corners of this big inflatable pool. She described how she used a stereo microscope, this handheld, to look closer at the pool, at fragments and anything that was there. She noted that there was a footwear impression, and she wanted to collect the impressions and attempted to by doing something called the electrostatic dust lifter to try to collect the footprint. And unfortunately, it was unsuccessful. She identified that it could be just due to the way the pool is. It's not a completely flat surface, so there was nothing to really pull the print. Now, on cross-examination in relation to this topic, Blair Burke specifically wanted to point out that at no point, first of all, that this print was unsuccessful in pulling up, and that no detective brought any shoes that were provided to compare to this print. And she agreed to that. There's never a shoe provided to see if it compared. So moving on, she noted about damage to the pool and some four areas of it, and talked about the different cuts, saying that there's straight linear cuts in it and then some scalloped cuts in it. And the damage went through several layers of this inflatable pool. Now on the screen, they were showing fragments of the pool that had been kind of separated from it, that had these scalloped edges from damage, and they were looking at these fragments, and she was kind of lining it up to see that it would match to the pieces of the pool. So, basically, here, let's do this. What we'll say is this. I have a piece of paper. I've ripped it. This is in separate places. She's taking fragments and explaining how she's going to be lining it up. Does it line up? And looking at it in that type of way of the analysis. So these pieces that fell out. Now, something that I made a note, this was not anything that factually was verified, but to me, I would like to see a tool analysis of a chainsaw, because the scalloped edging, to me, that damage, in my opinion, I would like to know if it relates to chainsaw markings. Now, on that cross-examination, Blair Burke brought this up, and something that I learned was she asked about a tool mark analysis on these cuts, the scallop and linear, and they said that LAPD does not have a tool mark analysis in their labs. They don't have that capability. They don't do that, which is shocking to me in this massive city, how they don't have something like that. And when asked how you would go about doing that or what steps would be taken, the witness described that you would have to send it out elsewhere, and there was no request for it. So that to me is a little bit of shocking. On the defense side, I see where that came up in cross-examination of why was there no tool mark analysis done to see what those type of cuts were. Again, my most interest, they had linear cuts and then the scalloped edging. Now, moving on, they went to talk about fragments that were collected at Celeste's autopsy and compared them to the inflatable pool, which is these medium and dark blue fragments. The witness went on to say that the ME office sent material fragments to compare and trace evidence. They came in these small little brindles, and she identified that there's possible hairs and fibers and pieces that matched that pool from the autopsy. Now, here's where they went over specifically as well the clothing that Celeste was wearing that was sent over for lab analysis. And here's what was sent over. The victim's clothing, Celeste, she had 2 black Skechers brand socks. There was 1 pair of black thong underwear, Victoria's Secret. there was one black Forever 21 tube top and one pair of black leggings. Now the leggings though were in pieces because, and this is a bad photo, but like here you've got, the top part, and then basically due to how she was cut, a little fragment for each other part of the leg. So you had three pieces that were shown of how the leggings came in because due to the mutilation. Now the witness testified that all of these pieces of clothing were all heavily soiled and they had numerous insects. The witness went on to say that the heavily soiling prevents her ability to do what she wanted to do in a lab analysis, so she couldn't get everything done. However, she also noted when these leggings came in, they had these medium and dark blue pool fragments, as well as dead insects in the clothing packaging when it arrived for analysis. Now, the blue fragment pieces with the clothing are very specific to the leggings. That's what they are being connected to. So not any other pieces of clothing, she said, to the leggings. It was also noted a possible glass fragment was from the leggings. Then after that, there was that cross-examination, which I already covered in my other notes. So again, that little piece was just connecting these pool fragments that were found to that inflatable pool and the pieces and fragments collected from Celeste's autopsy and the clothing that she was wearing. Now, the next witness that was up was Detective William Roker, who is spent 9.5 years with LAPD. He's also part of the FBI, the LA Violent Crime Task Force, and a cellular team with the FBI. He had prepared a 17-page report. He works with CAST, which stands for CAST, Cellular Analysis Survey Team. And his job of what he was going to testify has to do with two phone numbers. One being the cell phone that was identified to be connected to David Burke. That is the phone number. And the other number is the Tesla ISI number. They identified these numbers, and these are two numbers that he was tracking. What is interesting that he explained about the Tesla ISI number is that it works the same way as your cell phone and how it connects and how it tracks through cell phone towers. So he covered that and explained his history. He's been on this task force, and they help to connect, find fugitives, missing children, hikers, and they also train local state and law enforcement on called digital records. He previously worked for Verizon law enforcement research team. So when they would get a warrant, he would help pull that information and explain to them how to interpret the data and everything. So this man has a lot of experience. He's been doing this a long time. Now, during this process, when it came up, I did know that David was leaning in, looking at the screen. His hand was kind of on his mouth like this, just kind of really watching everything because this was displayed on a TV above the witness, and he was pointing things out as he was asked questions. Now, when they went into it, he had started off just explaining how these cell phone towers work and the pings and the areas. Now, here's the details that are important because we're going to talk about the specific timeline of the vehicle movements of the Tesla. And what's shocking is 3 trips to Santa Barbara area were taken. So this is new information. The detective was asked by the robbery homicide detectives to narrow down some certain time periods. The first one being April 23rd to April 24th, which is when we are having the homicide of Celeste and looking at those dates. So let's get into that. So I'm going to do my best to work off these notes. So on April 23rd, that evening, the Tesla triggered from between 11 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. at 1368 Doheny Place. That is where David's mansion is located in West Hollywood. It said that there were transactions with these signals at 11:01, 11:06, and 11:11 p.m. Now, continuing on that evening, between 11:30 to 11:36 p.m., the Tesla also pinged off of towers. The detective stated that the Tesla left that Doheny Place area prior to 11:31 p.m. And that's when it started moving away from the home. It was headed west on Sunset Boulevard. At that point, it had been moving over toward the west of Hollywood, heading towards the Santa Barbara area. And it pinged, 11:31 and 11:35 p.m. Now, again, he then was analyzing the time between 11:30 p.m. and 4:04 a.m. for travel. The travel went up to Santa Maria, which is part of Santa Barbara County. Now, David's cell phone number and the Tesla ISI number were identified as traveling together. So it is connecting them. And it went up to the area off of 154, where CHP testified earlier this week that they recovered the evidence along the tracked route of Celeste's passport card. So it was taking that and correlating everything, right? Bringing this together. Now, it also states that, so going into now overnight, right, April 24th, they were tracking everything. A phone call was made at 12:04 a.m. to a number. The phone number was identified as Celeste's phone number. Now, the defense objected here. They wanted to clarify that David doesn't make the phone call, that the device makes the phone call. So anytime they can't say David made a phone call, they have to make sure they say the device, the prosecution, and they cannot say that like David drove. They have to say that the Tesla moved in these routes. So what happened with this phone call at 12:04 a.m.? The call was noted by the detective as going through, but it went to voicemail, and it is marked as not reachable. What he means by not reachable for them is it identifies it as one of three things. Either the phone is on airplane mode, the phone is off, or the phone is out of network. Now, they continued tracking, and there was additional transaction to cell towers between 1:28 to 1:29 a.m. that again was in this cell phone, the cell phone in Tesla, whereby what they identified as Marcos Pass, where that evidence was recovered. Now, they tracked, and the car and phone were back at David's mansion on Doheny Place home at 7:06 a.m. So the timeline of that first evening is that the car left, kind of turned on sometime between 11, was pinging the first time and moving away from the home prior to 11:31 p.m. and then arrived back home at 7:07 a.m. So that was like the timeline of the first trip. Now we find out that there was another trip made. The second trip was made on May 8th to May 9th, 2025. This was another overnight trip. And the timeline of that is that it left the home around 8:01 p.m. from Doheny Place and did eventually arrive back at approximately 5:15 a.m. Now, in those overnight hours, after leaving Doheny Place around 8:01 p.m. on May 9th, 2025, the devices pinged at 1 a.m. in that same location where evidence was found from CHP that it was recovered off of the 154. Okay, so went back that's traveling up that same route. That is May 8th to May 9th. Now, they noted some other times of just, again, how everything was tracking and connecting to towers. Then we learned of a third trip that was made, and that third trip was made on May 31st, 2025. And when they were, the times are a little all over the place when they were testifying, but it appears that the Tesla and the device, the cellular phone, left Doheny Place at 1:25 p.m. and arrived in Santa Barbara area again around 5:51 p.m. Now, this does make sense. If you're leaving more in the afternoon at that time to get to that area, it's going to take you much longer in traffic. Once again, this was all following the same route, and around 6 p.m., it was identified that he was back in the area of this evidence that was found, again, off of the 154. Now, there were some transactions, again, on towers, and they identified specifically where the passport card was found and where his car was. They also identified a Tesla charging station. It's Tesla 2621 charging station off of the 154 in Santa Ynez, and he used this on his trips. And that information comes from the whole infotainment system that has all of the charging records, and that's also in that area of Lake Cochuma. So they arrived back on that May 31st date. It says approximately 8:19 p.m. So that trip was like another 7-hour trip of back and forth from Santa Barbara. And the detective just testified again that the cell phone and the Tesla were traveling together. At this point, we then were called to go on break for lunch. So I actually now have to head back up, and I will go live afterwards and do an update on everything else that comes out of the next part, but I do need to head back in. So I hope that does help clarify things.